This is a brief recap about neural networks. Let's go to my full desktop. So this is the architecture for neural networks. Here we have the input variable. Yes, this is t minus 1 is the previous period. T minus 2 is 2 periods in time, and t minus k minus 1 are also previous periods of the same variable. These inputs goes here into these nodes, the circles, and we are going to call these nodes the input layer. What neural networks will do is to find relationships between these nodes, and they are going to calculate those interactions in these nodes. So these interactions are different type of calculations. The same happens for each single node. Each single node is going to be an interaction between the same nodes. At the end, in order to get yt plus 1, yt plus 2, and the other future observations of the same variable, we will use this hidden layer with all these nodes that have been calculated, and we are going to do exactly the same. We are going to find the interactions between all these nodes to calculate gt plus 1, the same for gt plus 2, all the interactions for gt plus 3, all the interactions for gt plus k. And this is the way in which neural networks work, by simulating what happened actually in our brains. So behind the scenes, what we have in the training network is an iterative error minimization. So when we have these variables, we have weights, a new weight and an old weight. And by error and trial and error, the iteration is trying to find the best possible weights at certain learning rate. The idea is minimizing the errors. So in order to minimize the errors, we have backpropagation. Backpropagation compute errors from the last layer to the first. So if you remember, we had here a hidden layer. So in backpropagation, we actually use the errors to come back here to the input layer. And if we have the right values, the iteration will stop. If we have changes in the weights to arrive to the same input layer, so therefore backpropagation will adjust the weights that we have given to these interactions. Usually the initiation for the learning rate is something between minus 0.5 and plus 0.5. Backpropagation then is the most popular error minimization algorithm in neural nets, and it starts, as you can see here, this is the input layer. It calculates the weights for these relationships, and then it comes back with the error signal flowing backward to adjust the weights. The greatest strength of this method is when we have non-linear relationships. And you remember that non-linear relationships are relationships that are sometimes curves or sometimes different types of shapes in the curves. So that is why neural nets works very well when we have, for instance, datasets such as Forex, because it's able to find the non-linear solutions to those time series patterns. However, neural networks can be stuck or get stuck in local minimums. Yes, and so that is sending us bad signals. And that is one of the drawbacks of the algorithm. So in backpropagation, we have two options. Yes, case updating and batch updating. In case updating, the weights updated after each record is run through the network. So we are being updating each weights. And in batch updating, all records in the training set are fed to the network before updating takes place. So here we are using all weights at the same time. So in case of updating, completion of all records through the network is epoch. Yes, and here in this case the error is used for updating is the sum of all errors from all records. So this means that we are using here all the weights, all the data, whereas here we are using like just each relationship between nodes. So after one epoch is completed, return to the first record and repeat the process. So this is more about changing one iteration by one iteration, and in that process, a case updating takes a little bit more of time. Meanwhile, batch updating actualizes the errors from all records. So when to stop? So neural networks was not developed in the 80s and in the 90s due to the high level of processing time that we'll need. So it's just recently in which we have very fast computers in which neural networks have become like more usable. The usage has increased. So when to stop when in terms of iterations? First, when the weights change very little from one iteration to the next. That will let us know that we have found a minimum. Our algorithm has converged to find the best solution. Or when the misclassification rate reaches a required threshold. So when we are actually, the classification process is actually not working very well and is reaching certain threshold. Or when the limit of runs, the limit of iterations is reached. That is another case. Obviously, what we do not want to have is too many iterations because that will overfit the data. Overfitting the data means that the relationship that we have found through neural networks in this case is going to be working only for that particular set of time series, but not for the future data. So that is one of the problems that we need to avoid when using neural networks. So the number of iterations needs to be sufficient rather than extreme. So in order to avoid the problem of overfitting, we need to track the errors in validation data. So the process that we are using, particularly since the beginning of these sessions. So the use of training data and validation data. We need to limit the number of iterations. We need to limit the complexity of networks, for instance, adding 2 or 3 layers that will overfit the data, will have the risk of overfitting the data, and also the cross-validation of the results that we have found for our data. Okay, during the next video, I am going to explain more particulars about the neural networks, and in the last video I will present one example.